Well, thank you very much, Joanne, and I too join with you in acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and paying my respects to their elders past and present. Paul McClintock, lovely to see you again, and thank you to CEDA for the warm invitation and to the many important stakeholders who are here in the room. Well, how did we get here? A country which has the world's, or who is the world's largest exporter of coal, soon to become the world's largest exporter of gas. We have the world's largest reserves of uranium, and according to ARENA, we have the most sunshine and wind on a per capita basis anywhere in the world. But as you have said, the Prime Minister has described our current predicament as a crisis, and it's true, we have some major energy policy challenges. Our Chief Scientist, Alan Finkel, who's been tasked by the COAG Energy Ministers to produce a blueprint for energy stability, will report next Friday. He has described the transformation that is taking place in the energy system as the greatest in more than a century. Since the AC-DC wars, the wars of the currents, as it was called in the 1800s, between Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla. Because we have gone from what has been traditionally a very centralised energy system with everybody on the grid. Today, some 15% of households have solar panels on their roofs and solar hot water systems, the highest on a per capita basis anywhere in the world. A system that not only was heavily centralised, the power traditionally has been provided by state-owned utilities, and now we've seen a major privatisation agenda across that sector. And one where the power has been traditionally provided by synchronous generation. Overwhelmingly coal, but also gas, to our current situation where we're seeing a much greater penetration of intermittent sources of power, particularly wind and solar. Intermittent because when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining, power's not being generated. In wind's case, capacity factor of around probably 35%, and solar PV, depending on where it is, about 25%. Back in 2004, Australia got around 75%. We're talking about the national electricity market now, excluding Western Australia and the Northern Territory. Got about 75% of its power from coal. Today, that's around 60%. Back in 2004, got about 8% of our power from renewables, overwhelmingly, of course, hydro. Today, it's around 17% and soon to hit 23.5% by 2020. So there's been an incredible change in the power sector, and it's happening before our eyes. You would have heard about the Internet of Energy and how people using their iPhones or their tablets will be able to deploy their power as they see fit, regulate their power as see fit. And so this is a sector which has seen incredible disruption and continues to do so. And it's fair to say, I don't think we've been equipped. There have been major policy failures across more than a decade. And you don't need me to reiterate those again today. But what we are trying to solve for today is a trilemma of issues which I'll take you through individually. We have to secure the system. because what we saw in South Australia was the first time a whole state had gone into the black. 1.7 million people losing power. Gridlock on the roads. People confined to their homes. Big business energy users like BHP's Olympic Dam, or Arium at Whyalla, or Nearstar at Port Pirie, losing hundreds of millions of dollars as a result of the power going out. Tuna fishermen at Port Lincoln, seeing their whole catch ready for export rot as the freezers went off. Families losing their embryos in IVF clinics with no backup power. It's hard to fathom the implications of a whole state losing power. And we have to stabilise the system. The second thing we have to do is we have to drive down electricity prices. We have to make them more affordable. We've gone from having among the lowest energy costs in the OECD to now among the highest. Since 2004, prices have gone up by more than 140%. And this just doesn't matter to the businesses in the office, in this room. This actually means a lot to households, because a family, which is a low-income family, will spend 5 times as much of their income as a proportion on energy costs than a higher income family. And we've seen record numbers of people having to disconnect, particularly in places like South Australia, as a result of the high electricity prices. And then the third element of our trilemma is, of course, a lower emissions future. And committed as we are to the Paris agreements and our 26 to 28% reduction in emissions by 2030 on our 2005 levels, and when you consider that the power sector makes up 1/3 of the emissions across the country, what happens in the power sector when it comes to emissions will be very important, just like what happens in the built environment, in the transport sector, and in other industrial processes. So let me first take the issue of stability. The renewable energy target had a number of problems in its design. First problem was it didn't allow for the geographic emphasis that we saw in the build of renewables in South Australia. So South Australia today has 47% of its power coming from wind and solar. And the RET, without the South Australian government taking control in that state and putting in place the necessary backup, saw a lot of renewables go to one state. Another problem with the renewable energy target is it didn't price intermittency. So wind and solar was able to bid in at zero marginal cost into the grid, which means a lot for the way electricity prices are formed. And in the process, it helped displace, in the state of South Australia again, the Northern Power Station, which was providing baseload coal-fired generation. So there wasn't the necessary preparation around pricing intermittency. For those of you who are familiar with energy markets, you would be aware of the term FCAS, Frequency Control and Ancillary Services and Inertia. These are the services that come with baseload power, whether it's coal, whether it's gas, whether it's hydro. And when a consistent 50 hertz voltage is provided by spinning turbines, it creates stability in the system that you don't get with wind and solar. So not all electrons are created equal. And it's very important to understand that. So what we have to do, and what Dr. Finkel is looking at, is how do we stabilise a system where we've got, and we're welcoming it, a greater penetration of intermittent sources of power, how do we encourage the battery storage, the take-up of other forms like what we've seen with the snowy hydro, pumped hydro systems around the country. Pumped hydro is used for 99% of renewable energy storage across the world. But in Australia, we only have 3 facilities. We have the Tumut 1,500 megawatt pumped hydro facility. We have one in the Shoalhaven scheme, south of Sydney, about 500 megawatts. And we have one in Queensland, the Wivenhoe Dam there, with about 240 megawatts. So what the Prime Minister in Snowy Hydro 2.0 is seeking to do is create an extra 2,000 megawatts effectively of storage, enough to power 500,000 homes, and boost the capacity of the existing Snowy scheme by 50%. And we have significant studies underway by ARENA into other pumped hydro facilities in Tasmania, which has the potential to become the battery for the mainland, Kidston in Queensland, as well as in South Australia, a place called Kultana in the Upper Spencer Gulf. But what we're thinking about with pumped hydro is how do we create the storage necessary to stabilise the system. And batteries are coming down rapidly in prices. They've come down about 50% in the last 5 years, and they've increased their capacity by about 50% in the same period. So we're going to see dramatic changes in battery technology. But we have to think, how does intermittent sources of power provide their own storage? And how do intermittent sources of power provide their own FCAS and inertia? That is something we have overlooked to date. And how do we think about the geographical spread of intermittent sources of power? Because we don't want to see a repeat of what we saw in South Australia. We're very interested in other ways you can stabilise the system, and you would have seen that through the work of ARENA, which is in relation to what is called demand response management, where consumers, big and small, can be paid to reduce their energy take at times of peak demand, and in doing so, reduce the pressure on the grid, because what the grid is built for is those times of peak demand, so they could substantially reduce the gold plating that is required. They also benefit as consumers because they're getting paid, and we get more stability for the system. So they're some of the things that we're thinking about to stabilise the system, given the problems that we've seen to date. We've also got to put our head around the fact that when 9 coal-fired power stations have closed in Australia in the last 5 years, including Hazelwood with 1,600 megawatts, 20% of Victoria's power, we had very little notice. The average notice period for the last 5 coal-fired power stations that have closed have been around 5 months. Now, when you take something out of the system so large, you've got to think about its implications for both supply and demand, and I think we need to think more carefully about how we do that. The second problem we're seeking to solve for is affordability. And the way that energy is priced, 5-minute intervals, it doesn't matter the cost of what's coming in early in the stack. If it's a 1,000 megawatt stack, renewables will come in cheapest, then brown coal, then black coal, and the gas invariably is coming in at the end point, and that will set the price. And we have seen a dramatic increase in the wholesale cost of electricity in the last year, and what has driven that particularly has been the high gas prices. Now, this is an East Coast issue, not one that they have a problem on the West Coast for. But we've got ourselves into a position on the East Coast where we face a triple whammy. First element is that now we export 2/3 of what we produce. And when FID was taken for those 3 big projects at Gladstone I don't think anyone foresaw the challenges that we would now face. So we export maybe 1,400 petajoules a year, and on the domestic demand we use about 700 for the East Coast. The second issue that we're facing is these moratoriums and bans on conventional and unconventional gas extraction in a number of states. So Victoria has this mindless onshore moratorium on conventional gas extraction. That's not even fracking. Geosciences Australia says they're locking up 40 years worth of resources in Victoria and unconventional gas extraction. Now that's the manufacturing state of our country, with the highest proportion of people using gas at home, and it's locking it all up as the Gippsland Basin declines as a resource. I can't for the life of me understand why they've got in place those restrictions without understanding the impacts it has on jobs and investment. The Northern Territory has 180 years worth of unconventional gas extraction, and it's locking it up. New South Wales has reduced the amount of land available for gas extraction from around 60% to now around 8%. It imports 95% of the gas it produces. The one bright light is Queensland, which more than a decade ago, Peter Beattie was looking to import gas from Papua New Guinea. But as a result of the developments that we've seen there of unconventional gas, it is now supplying the rest of the country and supplying the export market. Now, in Australia, it's the states that own the gas resource under the ground. In the United States, which has had the Shale Gas Revolution, it's the landowner. So the landowner owns from the top of the earth to the bottom and everything in between. So they have benefited in the US to the point that they now have $3 to $4 a gigajoule gas, where we're in Australia, we see some companies being quoted $12, $14 a gigajoule. Back in 13-14, we had $3 to $4 a gigajoule. So what South Australia has done, which is really interesting and which the federal government supports, is it's said we will give 10% of the royalties as a state we get from the development of these gas resources to the landowner as an incentive for them to develop the resource. That is a really positive initiative. And we, as a federal government, have introduced, and it wasn't an easy decision, export controls on the export of gas from the East Coast, because we need to make it more available, because we have tens of thousands of jobs which are on the line as a result of the current high gas prices and electricity prices. So gas is important as a feedstock, but it's also important in setting the price of electricity. So gas is really important. Another issue is what sort of mechanism do we have to incentivise future investment in this country in generation, be it renewables or thermal, and that's something that Dr. Finkel is looking at. The last coal-fired power station built in Australia was 2007, Kogan Creek in Queensland, and the last gas-fired power station built in Australia was Mortlake in Victoria in 2010. Everything since that in our country has been renewables, obviously accelerated by the RET, and we saw a 5-fold increase on renewable investment in Australia in 2016 compared to 2015. And EY have said that Australia is now the 5th most attractive place to invest for renewables in the country as a result of the stability that we'd set with the RET. So the investment strike is not on when it comes to renewables, but we haven't seen investment in the other forms of generation for some time. And if we get more investment in generation, as coal-fired power plants close and they age, then we need to ensure the right generation mix, and therefore we'll have the supply to meet the necessary demand, and that will put downward pressure on prices. And finally, a lower emissions future. We have met our first Kyoto target, and we're on track to meet our 2020 target by 224 million tonnes. Our 2030 target is going to take a lot of work, but I'm very confident that we will meet it. And we're doing it through a combination of processes, not just in the energy sector with the renewable energy target, but we're doing with the Emissions Reduction Fund, which has secured 189 million tonnes of abatement at an average cost of $11.83 a tonne, which is very, very competitive. We've done it through a National Energy Productivity Plan, which is an idea to boost our energy efficiency by 40% by 2030. So particularly, for example, the built environment. A building today in Australia that was built after 2010 uses 30% less power than the same building built in Australia before 2007. An air conditioner sold in Australia in 2003 wouldn't be allowed to be sold in Australia today because it wouldn't meet the minimum efficiency standards. We can get huge savings across energy efficiency as a way of meeting our target. And just yesterday, and then today, yesterday I announced it, and today I introduced the legislation to amend the Clean Energy Finance Corporation to allow carbon capture and storage. This is part of our technology neutral approach because both the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the International Energy Agency, the IEA, say without carbon capture and storage, you can't meet your Paris targets in a cost-effective way. And everyone from the chief scientist to the CSIRO have endorsed CCS as a viable, effective emissions reduction reducing technology. And the key to understand about CCS and the CFC is it's not just for thermal generation, namely coal and gas, and there are 17 projects that are now in place working around the world, large scale, but it's also for industrial processes, steel, chemicals, plastics that can benefit from having CCS, and that's why groups like BlueScope, the biggest manufacturer in the country, 16,000 workers here and abroad, has strongly welcomed our CCS announcement. So, Joanne, that's a few introductory comments. The energy space is a very, very difficult one. The federal government doesn't have the silver bullet because there are lots of reasons for the situation that we're currently in. The federal government is not wholly responsible for energy markets. The states have a large amount of responsibility in this area, and that's why we have the COAG process. But when the Prime Minister asked me to take on environment and energy after the last election for the first time, bringing in those two portfolios, I had no idea what I was getting myself in for. And given it has destroyed two Prime Ministers and one opposition leader, I thought this will be easy. Not. So it's a very, very difficult policy space. There are big battles that both myself and Mark Butler have to have, both internally as well as externally. There's 1,001 stakeholders, but I think this is the main point. If we don't get energy policy right in this country, we'll be hurting our international competitiveness significantly, and we'll be hurting households even more. So we can't afford to fail, and the Finkel Review, hopefully, will provide a real window of opportunity for us to take this area of policy reform forward. Thank you very much.